good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you're able to tune into this episode In Conversation With. This is season 3 and we are in October already. Where's the time gone? I really don't know. I'm still trying to find it. But October is ADHD Awareness Month. And all of the conversations that we are having in October are around ADHD, around the support systems, around the experience of what it's like to go through the process of being diagnosed, what all of the connotations. And what I'm hoping is that Siobhan and I are going to be able to have a working live conversation with everybody very, very soon on actually answering the questions that people have but are scared to ask. That's to come in the future. But first, we've got to have the conversations. We've got to raise the awareness, and we've got to meet the people that this affects on a day-to-day basis. So I am absolutely delighted that in our second conversation of the month, we are going to be joined by an APA member who is a qualified social worker and living with ADHD. So please welcome, we can get everything set here. There we go. Jo.
Hello.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
I'm really glad that we've been able to get this conversation down and recorded. And yeah, we've talked about this a little bit kind of in the preparation to get the conversation set, but this isn't your first in conversation with.
No.
We've done a couple of conversations in season 2. We did conversation at the end of season 1. So how do you feel coming back to do an in conversation with specifically around ADHD?
I feel quite open to it, really. I think there are some issues potentially, around that sense of sort of stigma of the diagnosis, around people making assumptions about what that means, those kind of things. But I feel like if nobody sits and has these open kind of information things about, well, this is actually what's real, then that will never change. So I suppose that's where I'm sitting, really.
And that's where, when we've spoken in the past, that's come through so much that it was inevitable. It's early in the morning, come on. I'll put my teeth back in. It was inevitable that the conversation would lead to an invitation for you to take part. So I'm exceedingly grateful, and I know Siobhan, who was hoping to join us this morning, would attest to as well. The experience for you of living with ADHD is something that, when I first heard it, I thought that must be pretty unique, but it's not.
No,
And it did shock me when I kind of started to look into it and kind of get an understanding. But you've lived with this, so why don't we start off with what was life like pre-diagnosis?
okay. Do you want me to go back to childhood or
Where you're comfortable.
Okay, well, let's try and go back to childhood then, because that makes most sense, I suppose. I think through my childhood there were signs that I have ADHD. Those signs weren't really picked up by anybody, and I think that's partly because I was a very studious kind of pupil at school. So I was quite quiet. I didn't really disrupt any teachers or lessons. I wasn't rude. I just kind of head down, got on with stuff. And I was actually a pretty competent pupil, except in the areas that I struggled. So like things like English and sort of religious studies, anything where you were using language a lot. I always excelled, and I could do it very easily. I had no difficulty at all. And I also did really well, which is perhaps a bit less usual, but I did really well in things like the sciences, because to my brain they made sense. I was able to make sense of them, except for physics. And the reason for that is because I could not cope with maths at all. So that was where my huge deficit lay, was in maths. And then I would have struggles with other sort of associated things, which I'm sure were at least partially down to ADHD. So things like lack of emotional regulation was very strong, especially during sort of teenage years when the hormones are kicking in, all the rest of it. And you could tell that I was way beyond where my peers were. So it wasn't that, like, you could say, well, any teenage girl is going to say that same thing. I mean, clearly most teenage girls are going to say actually it's a pretty difficult time. Maybe some teenage boys do too, but like obviously I feel like it was a lot, mine was more extreme. It was always more, it was like more of than anybody else that I was.
There was an amplification.
Yeah. And so the reactions were more extreme. The amount of time that I would spend kind of trying to kind of recover myself from anything that seemed to happen was longer. So I think, and the same sorts of things affected me in a different way than what they did my friends. And then when I did bounce back, it was almost like a switch. So I didn't have a gradual like getting over something like a lot of people would do if they're neurotypical. I had a like I'm either really struggling or I'm like fantastic. There was no in between, really. But nobody really noticed any of that. And then outside of school, nobody seemed to notice the risk-taking behaviours that I kind of participated in. So there were certain things, like, I mean, just random things. Like I quite enjoyed going to the grounds of my primary school when they were not open, and I would climb onto the roof and hang out on the roof. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. But I would hang out on the roof. And I remember being there with some friends and things like that. And I was the only one climbing on the roof. And my friends were saying, don't fall. Like this it could be dangerous. It's like, how are you going to get down? And I was just like, so that's
I'll deal with that when I've got to come down.
Yeah, exactly. So
I mean, gravity will work at some point.
Indeed. Well, it did actually one day, because I literally fell through the roof into the classroom, into one of the classrooms, and managed not to sustain any real injury somehow. And then I casually walked across the classroom, opened the window, climbed out, and off I went. They never found out who that was.
And ladies and gentlemen, spoiler alert.
I know, it was me.
But for that caretaker, if you're out there.
I know. I think the school's closed down now, so it's fine. I can say it now. But like, just so things like that, I had no concept really of how to assess risk, or and it was like constantly seeking some kind of thrill, I suppose, through things like that, through the use of like alcohol, cigarettes, that sort of thing, before I was of an age where I should have been kind of participating in that.
And you said that as you saw that period,
Yeah,
nobody noticed.
no, nobody noticed.
Did nobody notice, or was it not noticed in the way that you would kind of notice now?
I don't know. I mean,
Were excuses made?
no,
Joe's being a delinquent. Joe's just a moody child.
not really. No, I mean, it was very like, no, not really. And actually, I didn't engage in those kind of behaviors at home, and I didn't engage in them when I was in school either. So it was kind of like I
You,
was able, for whatever reason, maybe I think this is maybe the female version of sort of masking. So I could mask quite a lot at home and at school.
hmm.
And then, but then when it kind of came out in those other arenas, like when I was with my friends, the because of having to mask the rest of the time, or feeling that I had to mask,
Hmm.
the I suppose the kind of explosion was bigger because of all the masking. So it's almost like those, slightly more extreme behaviors became they're like an outlet almost
Yeah,
for
it's a counterbalance.
what being pushed aside, pushed down, and then that's why they were kind of. I mean, obviously they weren't really, really awful, but they could have been a lot worse. But there are other things which I won't say on a recording.
Uh,
Let's not go there.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is still a PG show. Um,
But
but
like,
when you think about that masking,
yeah,
and it's becoming a lot clearer now that
yeah,
how female masking is very, very apparent.
yeah,
Um, to the point where diagnosis just becomes almost impossible,
yeah,
unless you understand masking
yeah,
and all of the agency inputs are working collectively, which we know even today, with all of the best intention in the world, everybody's confined to their own silo.
yeah.
So, with your experience, do you think, looking back, that the masking that you had in place, because to all intents and purposes, what you've described is high functioning engagement, right? You were able to blend and keep all of the pressure away until you weren't.
Yes.
And you also mentioned that in adolescent years, that masking became harder and therefore the explosions became stronger.
Frequent. Yeah.
Do you think that hormonal kind of control mechanism, if you like, was linked to the capacity to mask?
I think it must have been. I mean, it must be, because I'm not sure that anything else would explain it fully. And then if you fast forward to when I've actually been diagnosed, perimenopausal diagnosed, and it's kind of, so again, another period of time where the hormonal kind of elements, if you like, are very clear. Um, I suppose through my adult years, I do see quite a lot of cyclical kind of difficulties. So the difficulties would enhance. They never went away. They don't ever go away. But both the difficulties and the kind of positives were always enhanced at certain points in cycles, and like that's never changed really. So there were differences at different times in the cycle, differences when pregnant, differences just post birth, etc. And all of that has got to be like, there's no real other explanation for it than there's a hormonal element to how well you can mask or how well you can't, and to how your ADHD affects you internally. Or so a lot of my hyperactivity is in thinking rather than physically. So whereas you get a lot of male children and adults, their hyperactivity will be quite visible often. They often have both, but their physical inability to kind of settle and sit still, focus, those kind of things, is a lot more obvious in males generally, whereas females, it tends to be a lot more internal hyperactivity. So it'll be hyperactive sort of thoughts, racing thoughts, anxiety, feelings that kind of get out of control, those kind of things.
And I always kind of was told around, ADHD was not a term when I was growing, right? Nobody talked about it, right?
No.
It didn't have a label. It was naughty kids.
It was naughty kids.
Naughty things.
That was the label. Yeah.
And I was very lucky with the people I had around me growing up, and I applaud every single person that had an input in that, right? Because all of those behaviors were explained to me very much in the way that they are explained now.
Yeah.
So I was very lucky in that sense, but there was always an understanding that those behaviors were linked to something.
Yes.
The something was the unknown. The something was the magic that was their unique experience, right? And that's where it was. As I grew into adulthood and professional environments, everything else, it became a lot easier for me to identify those behaviors in an adult arena.
Yes.
Do you think the awareness that you've had and the experience that you've had has allowed you to do the same with others?
I think it took, I'm not sure. I mean, because it took such a long time to get to that place of diagnosis, I think maybe it has, but like not as direct as that, because I didn't really understand that was
what was going on
behind it. So I think I've always been a very intuitive person. Even as a child, I was very intuitive, and I've always been able to kind of read situations and kind of see people, even if they're not really showing their vulnerabilities. I've always been able to kind of just sense that, and I think the bit where my ADHD kind of helps me with that is that it gives me a sort of slightly maverick kind of bravery where I will ask that question. So I might be quite direct with someone as to what it is that I'm worried about or what I'm picking up, or I will kind of go straight for the straight for the direct approach. And I think that's because of my ADHD. I think that's the reason why I can do that, why I do that.
Yeah.
And what I've found is that generally doing that has meant that I do see what people are needing or where their difficulties might lie, even if they don't see it themselves. And kind of it just puts me in that position where I can actually then go and do some kind of social work things with them to try to alleviate that situation, whatever it might be. I just find that, now I see that might be partly down to ADHD, and it's not just it's not only well, that's your personality, that's who, you know, that's kind of what you're trained for, or any of that, I think has just
And
gone off.
yeah, and again, it comes down to an amplification of something that's already there. And this is what kind of has come through, I think, in a lot of the research, is that ADHD is like a Marshall amp at Wembley Stadium, right?
Yeah.
You once you're plugged into that amp, everything gets louder,
Yes.
the good and the bad.
Yes.
And sometimes the good can, to anybody outside, look like a miracle
Yes.
of capacity, of coping, of management, engagement, excitement. It's all off the chart up there.
Yeah.
And the bad is the polar opposite.
Yes.
And that, I think, would probably explain some of the misdiagnoses that have gone on in recent years.
Yeah.
And that kind of polar opposite personality presentation. I am not going to put a label on that, because I don't think that's fair. But
No.
it's a dual presentation or multiple presentation based on the situation that you're in,
Yeah.
because of your superpower to mask and present what's needed in that space.
Yeah. And, you know, there's, like, for me, there's elements as well of other, what you might call superpowers, that manage to balance the rest that isn't so super. And it's kind of like, you know, so when we talk about that bit, you know, about how the diagnosis was and what that meant, then I can tell you a little bit more about that if you want.
Well, that's exactly where we don't write a script for this, people. Honest, it doesn't.
I
But
told you I was intuitive.
and again, it's that connectivity, isn't it? There is a huge connectivity that comes for a lot of people
Yeah.
with ADHD.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's certainly for younger people, not having yet learned the skills to verbalize what it is that they're experiencing, that causes a bulk of the frustration.
Yeah, can do. Yeah.
And then that obviously plays out in, again, misdiagnosis, because they're not kind of picking up the big red flag. They're picking up the kind of little flags that are going, hey, look at the big one over there, please. So diagnosis for you. How, first off, how did you come to kind of make that decision to seek a diagnosis or to investigate one?
Yeah. I made the decision because of my son, who is 11 and was having substantial difficulties, mainly at school. And then, therefore, was coming home from school, was having attendance difficulties, was not really coping very well emotionally, was showing lots of signs that pointed to ADHD. So things like boredom, inability to sit still, you know, pretty classic male presentation, really. Very kind of emotionally sort of up and down, incredibly clever but bored, those kind of things. So lots of signs for him. So I got him a what's called a pre-assessment, which kind of looks for the signs in more detail. Found lots of them and clear indicators that he has ADHD. So he went forward for a diagnosis, mainly so that we could get some help for him in place at school, because that was actually really stressful and difficult. So partly that, and then obviously I started to learn a bit more about the genetic components of ADHD and some of the other signs that there can be ADHD present, like addictions and criminal behaviours and things like that. And I have that in my previous, not my previous family, you know, I mean, in my family history, not my own history so much, but the you know, close family members. And I just sort of started to think, oh, okay. Oh. You know, it was a bit like that. Yeah, it was a bit like that. And then I was talking quite a bit with Sarah Templeton, who I know you're going to be speaking with at a later point, and she was kind of all along sort of going, Joe, I think you have ADHD. And I was going, no, don't be ridiculous. So she was right.
For anybody who is curious, Sarah Templeton will be joining us in another episode. I think it's going to be next week. But she runs an amazing organization, support organization around ADHD. But I will leave Sarah to explain that in the episode.
Wish you would know that.
She's dynamite.
Oh, I know.
Absolute dynamite. Absolutely. And I think people will learn so much from a conversation with her.
Absolutely.
So you make the decision. There's all of these light bulbs going off, going, ouch. Okay, all right.
Yeah. Well, there was also, do you know, there was a big part of me that thought, right, well, here I am encouraging my son to embrace the fact that he has this thing called ADHD, to enhance the positive aspects of it and to support better the less positive aspects of it, and kind of sending him this message, this is okay, like this is okay, right? And I kind of thought, well, I can't do that if I'm not willing to go down that same road myself. So that was part of it as well for me. So yeah, I did go along and I had a diagnosis made. So in order to get a diagnosis, or you either wait for several years as an adult, and then if you're lucky, you might be assessed. If the health service, like your GP or whoever, agrees that there are enough signs that you're struggling to warrant sending you for that referral. So I didn't think that there was any real way that that was likely to happen for me, because I'm functioning so well in so many places. I didn't feel like it was very likely that they would agree to do that. And even if they did agree to do that, I didn't really want to wait like 5 years, because I just 7 years, whatever it was at that time, because I just felt, well, either I do it or I don't do it. So I did have to pay for that assessment to be completed, and it was very thorough. They did a lot of so they did some online testing of various cognitive processes, and I don't know, some fancy kind of fancy programs and things like that you had to sort of press this button if you were that, or this one if you were this, and like, you know, it tested things like short-term memory and decision making and risk assessment. It tested all sorts of elements, and then it looked for other sort of signs and symptoms in your history and currently, and then obviously the psychiatrist then meets with you and kind of goes through some of that, and they use those scores alongside talking with you about your presentation and your experiences, and obviously they observe you and all the rest of it, and then that's what they put together, all of those things, to decide, is there sufficient here to kind of meet the criteria to make a diagnosis. And what my psychiatrist told me was that I was I mean, he put it like, this is a bit embarrassing, but he put it that I was a genius in a couple of areas, basically. So he said that my kind of IQ, or whatever you want to call it, over a couple of specific areas was well over 180, which is considered genius level, right? And they were things very interesting. This is so the two that really stood out. He said generally most of your stuff is kind of on a fairly even keel, tipping slightly towards ADHD. But you've got these two that are like, you know, just where you've got amazing abilities, and then you've got another two where actually your abilities are basically rubbish. So and he said it's the combination of those things and what you described that leads me to conclude that you do have ADHD, and that your ADHD is predominantly inattentive, which I think is pretty common for females as well. You get a lot of females who are combined, which means both hyperactive and inattentive. You don't get so many that seem to be mainly hyperactive, not as many as you do in males. And then you get a lot, like myself, who are predominantly inattentive, but it doesn't mean that we're not hyperactive as well. No, see it always.
It's the balance of those elements, isn't it? And you know, hearing you kind of describe the, you know, genius on this level, not so genius on this level, reminds me Einstein was told pretty much exactly the same.
Yeah, I think he was
genius here, but he can't tie his own shoelaces. And you know, I think the understanding of the phrase genius becomes a lot more apparent when someone is neurodiversity aware.
Yes.
Because the world is full of geniuses.
Yes.
And if we look at the top performing, publicly acknowledged individuals that meet that criteria or successful in any area, you can normally find a link to a neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And that's a common denominator in all geniuses. It does, it's something that I wish education would promote and understand more. For those people that are experiencing it, because you can be a genius
and
struggle in these areas. This is no genius on this planet has ever not struggled. Period.
Agreed.
So, you know, the dynamic of the conversation is really important to highlight, that this is a balancing act of experiences. So post-diagnosis, how did it feel to kind of get that confirmation that that's where you were at?
Very mixed, really. So like I had times where I felt quite upset by that diagnosis, where I didn't really believe it, or I didn't want to believe it, where I felt like it reflected on me badly somehow in a negative way. And I think the message of that is really around the society that we live in and people's views of what it means to have ADHD or to be neurodiverse in some other way. And it's kind of I think it's taken, I still have my moments like anybody, but it's taken me probably a good year post-diagnosis to feel more able to be kind of out there with it and kind of own it rather than sort of try to hide it, I suppose, you know. So but I think, you know, at the end of the day, I've spent 52 years hiding it, so it's kind of like, you know, it takes a little while, I suppose, to kind of undo that, you know. And I suppose, you know, some of the messages that you get, even, you know, even now from schools, from parents, from those sorts of places, a lot of them, you know, say even about my son, have been very critical, or have felt critical, even if they weren't intended to be critical. So kind of like, oh, you know, well, you just have to try harder to get this person into school and able to participate. Um,
Heaven forbid, sorry, a school says we need to provide an environment where he wants to come to school.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And actually, you know, I suppose what's really interesting about my son in particular is that he's obviously gone off to secondary school now, and the difference in terms of how he's able to respond in that environment is huge, huge. He's only maybe twice kind of gone to a place where I thought he was going to start having difficulties again, and actually it hasn't happened, because that school have stretched him. They've acknowledged his strengths, they've encouraged him, they've provided some emotional support that suits him. They've kind of seen his abilities and put him into the appropriate kind of arena to enhance those, and then they've propped up the bits that don't work so well, and that's exactly what didn't happen.
And all of that work that's been done by the school, and congratulations to the school,
thank goodness, yeah.
for pulling that together.
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, it's very easy for us to look at this from the outside and see all of the things that are wrong with a fragmented system that is financially well overstretched,
Yeah.
and poorly kind of guided in these areas.
Yes.
It would seem from your experience as a parent that primary education struggle.
Yeah.
Secondary education, in this instance, and it's not uniform, and we have to acknowledge that this is pretty much the exception to the rule.
Yeah.
But when you've got that supportive joint working with you, the child, and the education provider, that triad kind of supports itself in the end, doesn't it?
It does, and it makes, you know, I think it saves everybody some time. I think it saves a lot of stress. I think it saves a lot of sort of knock-on effects of things that perhaps would be needed if that wasn't in place. So, you know, it's made an amazing difference, and it's, you know, like, I cannot describe how relieving it is. And I think even, you know, like, when you're sitting as a social worker with lots and lots of experience and very capable to navigate systems, very knowledgeable about what should happen, it knows the law, all the rest of it, you know, like, and I can advocate with the best of them for almost anyone except for myself, really. Like, even then, I struggled. And I'm kind of, well, and if that's the case, then, you know, I feel strongly that there are many others out there who obviously will struggle because they don't even have that starting place of that knowledge and that experience that they can draw on, and they're just
and this is why that joint working, getting away from the multidiscipline silos,
yeah,
is that much more relevant to an effective solution.
yeah,
And it's what APA advocates in the framework for positive mental health around children connected to the system, whether that's education, whether that's social care, etc. But the understanding that how a child performs or an adult in the workplace performs isn't the entirety of that person's lived experience.
No, it isn't. But, you know, something else that people often point out to me is how I'm not a classic social worker, I suppose, in that I don't work directly for anyone. I'm self-employed, independent social worker, and that's something that has been the case for 10, 11, 12 years now. Almost half of my career. So that's quite a long time. And what a lot of people say is that there's an awful lot of difficulty for ADHD people to function in a work setting where they're an employee because of the expectations to be typical. And obviously we can't be typical, can we?
And it actually amplifies all of the pressure points that kind of make masking even more important, etc., etc. And when we look at kind of the impacts of that amplification, we can see all sorts of negative outcomes in what that creates. So there's a couple of things that I really want to pick out and hope that people that are watching, and thank you for staying with us and kind of going through this journey, because APA is dedicated in so many different areas, and awareness is just one. And designing programs and support frameworks for change is not easy without that awareness. And we see a lot of people and a lot of organizations who advocate change without a framework that's different to the one they're already using. It kind of, if you've got poisoned fruit coming off of the tree, don't keep growing the tree. But you have succeeded in not only going through life with all of the masking and everything else that you put in place for your survival in the situations that you were in.
Yeah.
You have succeeded in a career that is exceptionally hard.
Yeah, it has its moments.
And I suppose maybe this is in part down to ADHD as well, but it is a profession of extremes, extreme highs and extreme lows.
Yes.
And everything in the middle is kind of pulling in both directions at the same time.
You can't even pay attention to anything that's in the middle because there isn't time. That's
what I mean. Everything is pulling in one of those two directions.
Yep.
So the whole kind of story of your history is one of succeeding against the odds. Succeeding within education, succeeding within the workplace, succeeding as an entrepreneur in your own business, against everything that would have been said and believed as possible, even if you'd had the diagnosis earlier, 11 years old.
Yeah.
Or earlier, right? So the takeaway from this is one of success, not one of survival. Because you're succeeding in all those areas.
Yeah, and I believe now that I probably succeed in those areas because I have ADHD, not despite having ADHD. And I suppose that's the message that I want people to understand, that there, of course there are very significant difficulties in some areas, of course there are, but because of ADHD, that's why I've been able to do what I've done.
And that, for anybody that's watching, for any parent, for any young person, please share this as much as you can, because ADHD is not a anchor that weighs you down unless you let it. It is something that you can throw out in front of you and pull you forward. And it is a phenomenal capacity that, in my mind, in our human history, we would all have been classed in that same category. And it's only through survival that we have suppressed those neurodiversities in order to survive as a mass. Those of us that are able to connect to that core part of our brain have phenomenal potential. And like we said earlier, every genius on this planet has always had a string back to some level of neurodiversity. No genius gets away without it, unfortunately. So, as we draw this to a close, you've gone through your career and you've become an APA member.
Yes.
What for you has being connected with APA meant, and has that been impacted by your understanding of ADHD as that's developed?
I think it's meant that I can be a part of a sort of community of other people who like to work in a similar ethical way that I like to work, and who have that kind of background knowledge of why things happen, if you like, why humans struggle, why things go wrong for people, that's that sort of understanding, I believe, is vital within social care, and it's kind of a bit absent from a lot of social care, unfortunately. So I suppose I just feel that I have that sort of professional connectivity within APA that I can't get anywhere else, like, because that's, it's not, obviously I can be a member of the British Association of Social Workers because I'm a social worker, and I am, but that provides me with other social workers, right? It doesn't cross over so much into any other arena, and I think that's what APA provides for me that I can't get in any other setting. And then I suppose, from the ADHD side of things, I feel like APA are very clear about trying to raise profile of certain things such as this, but that also it's not just about awareness on its own, because I think that can get a bit trite, really, like, oh, let's all be aware. Well, it's no good being aware if you don't do anything with that awareness, is it?
So I can remember Dave Prowse telling me many years ago, you can be aware that there's a car on the road, but if you don't stop walking in front of it, you're going to keep getting hit.
Making a difference. Yeah, exactly.
Awareness is great, but if you don't do anything with it,
Enough on its own, and I think there's a lot of that out there, in general, where it's like, oh, let's all be aware, let's be trauma informed, let's be ADHD aware, let's be let's be this, let's be that. And actually, if you don't change your practices or the way that you organize things, those settings are still inaccessible to ADHD people.
Yeah. And I'm really delighted that APA is still, I'm delighted is the wrong word. I'm actually embarrassed for our sector that APA is still the only accreditation service that provides a verbal assessment pathway for anybody that wants to join. So they don't have to go through the form filling, they don't have to go through all of the kind of attachment and everything else and all of the anxiety that comes with that for some people. There is a verbal conversation that does all of the paperwork for you. There is the opportunity to provide essays through video rather than written. There is statements through video rather than written, and it allows people the comfort to do things at their pace when they're ready, because again, we're the only organization that will not take your money before you have been accepted. Now that, I think, is pretty sad state of affairs, but I am glad that APA is standing to that, and I am glad that Siobhan has advocated that from the rooftops as much as is possible.
Yeah, I agree.
So Joe, thank you so much.
Very
I know that you're going to be taking part in my path, my history to your path, and that conversation will look kind of in a bit more detail at the experience of that journey, and hopefully those people that are experiencing similar will be able to kind of get some more from that.
Yeah.
So thank you for your time. I
Very
hope
welcome.
you've enjoyed the conversation. I know I
I always enjoy a conversation.
have.
I can talk with the best.
And there comes. But if you've learned anything from this, if you've discovered anything that's going to help you in your practice, in the work that you do, you can get CPD certification just by completing the CPD questionnaire that will be attached in the comments of the description, sorry, of this video. We will see you again in another conversation very, very soon. But for now, take care. Look after yourselves.
Thank you.